Snow fell the way ash drifts from a dying hearth, slow and unhurried. Not yet the hard storm that blinds men and buries waystones, but the kind of fine weather that softens edges and quiets voices. Jon Snow watched it from the godswood while Ghost nosed along the bank of the steaming pool, pale against pale, the dogwood's red twigs bright as cuts against the whitened earth. The weirwood's face was rimmed in silk frost. Its eyes, the old deep red, were wet with thaw where the breath of the springs rose and, mingling with cold, made a little weather of its own. He had come to the godswood before anyone else stirred, though he knew old Nan would be awake with the first creak of the keep. The godswood did not mind him. The bench he favored had a lean of moss along the back that was damp even in winter, and it took the shape of his shoulders, as if he had left a mark on it the way a man's hand smooths a sword grip. The river of steam that ran along the pool could make the morning seem warmer than it was. He rested his gloved hands between his knees and watched Ghost place careful paws on rocks slick with rime, the direwolf's breath condensing in steady clouds that already beaded frost along the whiskers. The sound came again, the low thrum he had started to notice 2 mornings past. It was not the wind, nor the water gurgling where it met stone. He thought of a heartbeat, slowed and deep, felt through the body more than heard through the ear. When he laid a palm to the bench, he fancied he could feel a faint pulse in the wood, a little jarring, like the smallest hammer striking from some distance. If he told anyone, they would say the springs did it. Water did many strange things under Winterfell. He pressed his lips together, as if he could seal away the urge to speak. Ghost lifted his head, ears pricking, and turned toward the trees that walled the far end of the garden. His eyes, as red as the weirwood's leaves, narrowed to slits. Jon stood, the bench scraping on stone in a sound that would wake every memory of the yard's reprimands. "Quiet, boy, how many times have you been told not to drag the seat?" But there was no one here to chide him. He put a hand to Ghost's neck. The wolf quivered, muscles taut under the pelt. Jon's thumb traced a path in the fur without thinking, and he whispered something that he did not intend as a word at all, only the kind of murmur one offers a skittish animal. Ghost's ears flicked. Then, sudden as a decision, the wolf leaped down from the rock, landed without a slip, and trotted along the narrow path that ran between the gnarled roots of the weirwood and the old wall of rock and brick. "Ghost," Jon said. He followed. The air changed here. The warmth from the springs was stronger, and the smell richer, a mix of earth and iron and something like roasted chestnut. Winterfell did that, threw up new scents from its belly the way the kitchens did from their ovens. The thrum seemed stronger too, as though the space itself held breath. Ghost stopped at a seam in the ground, a place where a long root had heaved the paving a finger's breadth and the moss between stones went from bright green to brown-black. The direwolf sniffed. Then he pawed at a tuft of moss, tore it free with a snort, and nosed at the void that opened there. The crack was narrow, barely wide enough to admit a man's fingers. Ghost drew in a long breath and made a sound Jon had not heard from him before. Not a growl or a whine, but something questioning. Jon crouched. The seam breathed warmth up, like air from a stable after dawn, as if a great animal lay somewhere below. He laid his palm flat over the crack and felt it again. Thrum, thrum, the hammer much nearer now or closer to the surface, or his skin had learned to hear it. The gods did not speak to bastards, not in stories Nan told, but he held his hand there as if he could make out a word in the beating. He did not. He drew in a breath, slow against the cold. He could taste the iron and stone in it. His mind, which was often quick to flit from thought to thought, did not move. He stayed, feeling the warm seam, until the bells sounded to rouse the castle. He stood and Ghost lifted his head so that Jon's fingers fell, as if by accident, into the thick ruff at the wolf's neck. "Come," Jon said, and they went out the way they had come in, past the weirwood and the garden path, to the door that opened toward the servants' stair. The yard was filling with men by the time he crossed it, each one's breath plume matching another's, the sword master's sharp voice carrying like a whip crack. The kitchens had their own weather. The warmth came like a wall, and the smell, porridge, bacon fat, smoke, went straight to the hunger that winter always kept keen. If he spoke of the seam to anyone, it would be to Maester Luwin, who would tilt his bounds of chain and take down a leather book and make a note and nod as if Jon had said something sensible. He would not tell Theon. Theon would laugh and then lay it along Jon for caring about cracks in stone when there were boars to ride down and girls to chase. He would not tell Robb, not yet. Robb would listen. Robb listened the way a good hound does without taking his eye off his work. But telling Robb often meant telling all of Winterfell in time, because that was what happened with a lord's son. What he knew, others knew too. Better to hold it under his tongue for a day. Better to listen again tomorrow, to see if the beat stayed or faded, before he made a fool of himself and had Luwin send a boy down with a chisel. Eddard Stark took his bread without peace porridge that morning and did not seem to notice when Catelyn slid the small dish nearer to him, the way she did out of habit from Riverrun's table, where it was considered a kindness to mind a man's plate when his thoughts went elsewhere. His eyes, hooded and a little red at the edges, had a cast that meant a night in the crypts. She knew him well enough now. Ash. He rose from their bed at times during the worst cold, when the wind made wall pegs rattle and the hall felt too full of breathing to sleep, and went down with a candle. If she woke and found him gone and the candle missing, she knew not to follow. He returned with damp in his hair and the smell of the crypt's old stone under his skin, and moved through the room as quietly as the shadow of a passing cloud. She had not asked him who he spoke with down there. The dead were family he had known before he knew her, and kindness sometimes meant letting a man have his grief in peace. Robb has the men drilling along the east wall, Catelyn said, because it was easier to talk of walls than of worry. The ice that built up last month broke loose and tore away 2 of the crenels, and the masons would be happier not to have swordsmen underfoot while they work. He nodded. I'll look. He tore crust with rough fingers, not the neat way her father would pick bread with a knife. He had the north in him even when he sat at her side on a soft chair in the solar, and she did not wish it otherwise. She had been a girl who thought she wanted summer forever, and then she had married a man who was Winter's brother and learned that summer could be a flattering liar. Sansa sat as Septa Mordain had taught her, back straight, hands folded, eyes on the bowl like a little lady with a mind only for the act of eating. Arya, at the other end of the bench, had a smear of bacon grease along one cheek and a stare angled at the yard door, already measuring the distance she would need to slip away unnoticed. Bran, between them, swung legs that were just a touch too short for the bench to fit him, and every swing brought his boot heel to the seat with a soft thud. Rickon bounced, because Rickon did not know how to sit quietly and was not asked to yet. Theon laughed when he saw the boy's feet, a sound like the roll of a bead across a table, and Sansa narrowed her mouth the way she did when she wanted to remind the world she was older than she seemed. Your men should not have sharpened edges on their practice swords, Catelyn said. I saw blood in the yard. A nick, Ned said absently now. The cold cracks hide. The boys need reminding where the weak spots are. Better a nick now than a broken head in spring. He drank his small beer and set the cup down as if he had not tasted it. Catelyn had learned to watch how he laid down a cup. There were ways a man set things down that told you whether his mind was on them. He set his cups like a man whose thoughts were elsewhere, and she measured the distance to those thoughts and found the crypts again. Maester Luwin came from the rookery with the smell of feathers and a little wild air in his gray hair. The chain at his neck, which she had once thought handsome, like a fine torque carved by Smith's clever hands, was only an ordinary thing now, always faintly smudged with a powder of soot. The ravens are restless, he said without preamble, as if they had all been in the rookery with him. They talk among themselves in a fashion they reserve for snowstorms and births. Births? Theon grinned, his teeth very white in the brown of his face. Unless the maids have been less careful than I thought, there's no child due. Maester Luwin gave him a look that would have sent any of the children to their needlework with lowered eyes, but Theon took it as he took everything that was not a joke or a challenge, as something not entirely about him. Animals have patterns, the Maester said. Birds and wolves and men alike. I only note the way this morning smells to them. Is it another blizzard? Arya asked, hope and dread braided freely in her voice. I don't think so. Luwin's tired eyes flicked toward Ned, who had leaned forward a half inch. It has a different shape. Tell Mikken to keep men on the wall work, Ned said. If it's not a storm, I'll not lose a day to fretting. We have only so many bright hours before the turn. Arya, you will go to the Septa. Robb with me. You too, Theon. He pushed back his bench. Catelyn, who could feel the roil of servants and men in the corridor as if the corridor were a river and the current were touching her ankles, stood with him, smoothing a hand across her skirt so that the cloth lay with no memory of where she had sat. The yard air bit the inside of her nose. The light came pale, as if the sky were a belly stretched too thin. Men had scraped a path across the yard stones with shovels. The scraping sound went up her spine like a rough glove drawn over skin. Ned paused at the well to speak with a mason whose shoulders were rounded from years under stones, then moved along the wall walk stairs with Robb and Theon close behind, Robb's stride already a copy of his father's. The habit of reading distances had served Catelyn before. She measured the interval between Robb's heel and Theon's, and it was not quite a step longer than yesterday. There were ways a house shifts as its air grows. Septa Mordane's voice in the solar had the rhythm of a weaver's shuttle, steadying and inexorable, passing from catechism to history to the small lessons of courtesy. Catelyn settled her hands around a cup of spiced wine for warmth more than appetite, and half listened while she took a needle up and set it to mending a glove with a neatness that would have pleased Riverrun. It was not a task she needed to do. There were women whose work it was to keep clothing whole. But the small act of bringing a thing back from frayed to sound steadied her. The Septa spoke of queens and saints, and Sansa's eyes, which Catelyn watched over the rim of her cup, had that far look they took on when she was laying elaborate dreams over the day like lace. Arya's needle flashed without much regard to neatness. She looked at the sunlight patterning the wall, at the sparrow that landed on the sill and pecked at nothing, at her own hands, as if each thing were as interesting as any other. When the sparrow fluffed itself and flew with a little spurt of droppings in farewell, Arya's mouth curved. She glanced toward the door so quickly no one but a mother would have seen it. "Stay," Catelyn said gently, before Arya's body could make an idea of her glance. "When the lesson is finished, you may go." Arya sighed and a strand of hair fell into her eye. She blew it away with a tiny huff that would have been childish in anyone else and was somehow only Arya in her. Sansa hid a smile and bent stubbornly to her stitch, as if she might stitch her sister into quiet if she worked hard enough. Later, in the yard, while Robb cut a stripe of sky with his practiced sword and Theon moved like an eel around him with a smirk that demanded correction, Jon found his way to Maester Luwin's tower with Ghost a white shadow at his heel. The Maester's chamber was a tangle of books and bottles and little dishes of powders. The glass candles on the shelf, black and green, had never been lit in Jon's lifetime, and he wondered sometimes, looking at them, if they were for ornament only, an admission that even a learned man liked pretty things. The rookery door stood ajar. A raven's croak came like a knot of wood catching a blade. "Maester," Jon said. "Ah." Luwin set down his quill. There was ink along the side of his thumb, ground into the creases of skin. "Ghost," he said, with a lift in his voice that made the word different from the way anyone else said it. He liked the wolf, Jon knew, because the wolf kept fewer secrets than men did. "What do you hear, Jon Snow?" Jon glanced at the raven. It cocked its head as if it would answer for him if he waited. "The seam by the weirwood breath's warm," he said, and it sounded to his ears foolish as soon as he had said it. He pushed on, because turning back halfway through a thing made most things worse. "There is a beating under it, not a knock in the pipes, not the springs bubbling. I put my hand to it, and it is there as sure as my own pulse." Maester Luwin's face softened the way a man's face softens when a child brings him a beetle cupped in both hands and holds it toward him with reverence. "Interesting," he said, as if that were the only word worth using on any subject. "Warmth in odd places has always been Winterfell's way. I will send a boy to look to it. If the paving has heaved, someone might twist an ankle." "Don't send a boy who will speak of it to every man in the hall," Jon said. "If it is nothing, let it be nothing without a crowd come to laugh." Luwin, who could be severe without seeming so, dipped his head. "Very well. I will go myself when the ravens are fed. The iron bird does not like to be kept from its meat," He tossed a kernel to the raven on the shelf, which caught it in a quick snap. And men who put off feeding birds often forget more than birds they intended to feed. His gaze flicked again to Jon's face, and if he saw the outline of some hurt there, he did not press his finger to it. "You are sure it is not in your own head that the beat sounds?" "I'm sure," Jon said. He was not entirely. The heart makes people fools. He had seen it. He set his hand to Ghost's neck again. The wolf's heat was alive and animal and ordinary. It steadied him more than the maester's words. Luwin nodded. "I will look." If Jon had expected to be told, he waited in vain. For the day filled its hands with other tasks and set its foot down on the next with the kind of slow insistence the North had for time. The men needed their drill. The smith needed his orders. The steward needed Ned's hand on a matter of salt and apples. A messenger came from a holdfast with a complaint about a band of foxes that had emptied a henhouse as neatly as coin lifted from a purse. Jon went where he was not needed and did what work he could do without being in the way. When the sun reddened and the day's breath drew slower, he passed the yard and saw Robb red-cheeked and grinning. A bloom of pride he let himself have now and then in a way that made Jon's chest ache in an old familiar place. Theon clapped him on the shoulder and said something that made Robb throw back his head. The sound of their laughter went up like sparks. At supper, Ned was more present to his wine than his bread, and Maester Luwin spoke not at all of the seam. Jon took that as answer enough for the night. He slept and dreamed a dream with clean edges that held in the morning. A snowfield, and 3 black stones half buried in it, steaming without fire. The weather held soft and brittle for a week. Men said it was false weather, which was an old men's way of saying the sky was tricking you. The dead of winter kept to the horizon, moving along it as you move your hand along the back of a chair, making no noise while you decide where to sit. The seam in the gods would breathed and beat as it had before. Once, when Jon put his cheek to the ground like a hunter, he thought he heard, not through skin or ear, the smallest suggestion of something like a thing in an egg, but when he laughed at himself it was because he knew eggs were heat and damp and shells. It was stupid to think of eggs in stone. Catelyn, who could read worry on faces as if words had been inked there, noted the way Maester Luwin tapped his quill twice before he set it to any task. The ravens still muttered as if they had a secret and could not keep from pecking at it. At the same time, her own house had its smaller eddies. Sansa pricked her finger and cried out and then laughed when the Septa told her the saint who pricked herself had been saintlier for it. Arya slipped down the hall with her hair tied back and a boy's cap wedged over it, thinking herself invisible. Bran learned a new way to put his foot on stones so that he could climb quicker. The little business of a family kept Catelyn busy enough that she let the bigger worry slide behind her like a shadow that you cannot outrun. On the 8th night after Jon had first felt the sea, a storm rolled in from the sea. You could taste the salt in the wind before men came in from their errands with snow stiff as dried foam caked along their beards. The air pressed low and the sore joints of the old men at the table sang. Jon went to the God's Wood with Ghost because the press of people in the necessary places made him itch. Ghost made paths with his muzzle, shredding drifts that rose past Jon's boots as if they were old cloth. The trees of the God's Wood were coated to the elbows in white, and the weirwood looked like a thing that had grown out of winter itself. Streams of steam rose thicker, billowing in the gusts. The air smelled of stew and forge. The seam sounded harder. Jon knelt with a small candle, the kind he borrowed from the torch niches because he knew now not to bring a bigger flame into the god's place. It felt wrong, and he, who was wrong in so many rooms he entered by simple fact of his birth, would not be wrong here. The flame slanted as if the seam itself were breathing out and in. Snow creaked. Ghost turned and put his body between Jon and the trees, head high, and made a sound from the bowl of his chest. The next thrum came not as one stroke but as 3, close together, a taut drumming that made the candle flicker and go to a thin blue spear before it righted itself. Stone shifted under Jon's hands. He felt the tiniest give in the paving, like a jaw in sleep. He jerked his hand away and could not say why. The sense was not of danger but of trespass. He rose to his feet and the seam breathed on his ankles. He stood above it with his toes at the crack, and a thought formed in his mind with such clarity that he did not know it had words until he found he had whispered them aloud. "It's ready," he said. He did not know what he meant. Ghost's ears twitched. Snow breathed all around them, all at once. He ran to find Maester Luwin and was made to wait because Luwin had gone to the rookery when the storm came on, and there were always letters that should go sooner rather than later. He paced the hall and looked at tapestries he had seen 1,000 times as if they were new, at the long-ago women who had tamed horses with nothing but rope and a word, at men standing knee-deep in river with nets. He listened for Robb's voice, for Theon's uncontainable laugh, for any sign that someone else's day had split open as his had done. There was no such sign. The hall had its usual noise and heat. Luwin came at last, smelling of lamp oil and the cold little bodies of birds. Jon said what he had to say, and the maester said what he always said, which began with a word of interest and ended with a practical suggestion. "We will look then," he said. He took 2 candles and a small prybar from a trunk near his desk. Jon said nothing of prybar and gods. It was true that the paving should be sound and a wrong stone taken up and reset. They went by way of the small back stairs and came to the gods' wood under a sky that was not the same sky that had hung over Winterfell 2 hours past. Snow came hard now and wind made it fly sideways. They crossed to the seam with their heads bent. The prybar slipped under the edge of one stone with a sound like a knife pressed into fruit. Luwin drew and the stone came up too easily, as if the ground itself were giving it over. Warmth rose from the hole, heavy as breath. He set the stone aside and levered up another. The seam opened like a lidded eye. The space below should have been packed with rubble and old spoil. Instead, it was dark and empty in a way the eye cannot accept. Luwin held his candle over it, and for a moment the chamber below took the light and showed itself only enough to make a lie of itself. A slope of brick, a brace of old timber, something like the curve of a wall, then nothing. The light did not fall to a bottom. It was swallowed. Ghost pressed his muzzle to the lip of the hole and drew breath so long and slow that it seemed the wolf meant to drink the air. His hackles lifted. "We should fetch Lord Stark," Luwin said, which sounded like caution and permission both. "No," Jon heard himself say, and was surprised by his own voice. "Not yet. Let me—" He did not know what else to say. He set his hand on stone. It trembled like a horse's flank when a fly walks there. They brought Ned at last because propriety was a kind of god, too, and because some doors at Winterfell opened first for him, whatever the gods would thought. He came with a guard of 2 men who stood back at the edge of the path. He set his boots at the lip and put eyes narrowed against the wind into the warmth below. "There is a void," Maester Luwin said. Wind lifted his hair and set the chain at his neck to its small clinking. "Near the root of the weirwood. Old masonry. I think it a forgotten cellar." Ned crouched and held his candle the way a man holds a mirror, careful of the angle. His face made a shape around the light that Jon had seen once when Ned had held his newborn nephew, back at the time when Jon had known nothing of the weight of such moments. He did not know what Ned saw. He only saw Ned, and then saw the way the Lord's hand tightened on the candle when the breath rose from the hole warmer than before. "Go no farther today," Ned said. "Seal it against the storm. In daylight we will send down a rope and see what is there." They set stones back into the seam with a care that made Jon's teeth ache for speed. Luwin chalked each stone to mark its order so that it would go back as it had come out, which was the kind of detail men like Luwin remembered and called wisdom. The warmth pushed against Jon's ankles, then retreated like a sigh when the last stone set home. Snow covered their work before they crossed the yard. That night, Ned went to the crypts, not because he feared what lay under the gods would, but because when the dead stirred in the ground you had to look the dead you loved in their carved faces and say the names that belonged to you. Say. Tellen watched him leave with the candle cupped in his hand, watched him move through her room like someone else's memory, and did not follow. She sat in the chair by the hearth and propped her feet toward the coals as if heat could be reckoned like coin. She had the Septa's lesson in her head without any of the words, only the sense of old things repeating. Rickon slept with his knees drawn up. His little mouth moved as if he were tasting a stew. She smoothed his hair. It sprang back stubbornly to its own disorder. Snow crawled along the hall, blown in under the door and melting on the stones as if the castle were bleeding white. In the rookery, The ravens spoke in short words of their own, clicking and croaking and fluttering so much that Maester Luwin soothed them with his voice as if they were children, his hand out, "Hush, hush," though some pecked his knuckles. He thought of all the messages that rolled like rats across the sea ice. Births, deaths, small lordships trading grievances, the weather, the kings. He wondered what to write to whom about a hole in ground and a beat in stone. He set down no word. He doused his lamps one by one and listened to the storm wear itself like a tired horse, and when the last lamp went down, the rookery was a box of soft sounds, and then a sound not soft at all ran through it, a low, steady sweep that moved as far-fetched wing moves when the head raven makes a wide circle over the yard. But there was no wing in it. Luwin stood very still and let it pass through him the way cold sometimes can. Bran woke to a house he could tell by its sound had been changed while he slept. He saw the pattern the snow had made along the sill and thought of the path he could take along the outer wall where the icicles grew, and how they would be fat and glassy now, and how Hodder would shout in his gentle way if he saw Bran's toes on the parapet. He put his palms to the window and left 2 prints that were ghosts of his hands, and then climbed the chest to pry open the shutter just enough to let his breath out. Winterfell smelled the way the world smelled when the cold was so honest you forgave it. He laced his boots and thought of the way he could go out and down and then up and along to the crenels where the gap had been, but he was not a fool. You did not climb a wall in the first light after a storm. You waited until the snow clenched itself down into a layer that would hold you as a good man holds your weight when you lean to him. He found Arya already gone when he went to seek her, which did not surprise him. He found Rickon with old Nan, who was telling him a story not in any of the forms Bran knew. She seemed to be making it up, except old Nan did not make anything up. She simply remembered longer than the rest of them had been alive. "There was a time," she said, "when fire came down from the sky and struck the sea and made steam so thick a man could walk on it and not know he walked on water. There was a time when things lay under the roots that were not roots and answered when called. And there was a time when the last of the Winter Kings took a wife with hair like the inside of a birch, and she could ride the back of a storm as if it were a pony, but only when it blew from the north." "What fell from the sky?" Rickon asked, delighted already with any answer that suggested stones you could pick up and put in your pocket. "Stones," Old Nan said with relish, "that were not from this world, and some white as milk and some black as night, and they had not the weight a stone ought to have." She glanced at Bran then, as if to say, "This part is for you, who will climb where you ought not. Men are always finding what they were not meant to, and the gods have to decide whether to let them keep it." "Do the gods argue?" Bran asked, because the weirwood faces sometimes looked to him as if they would argue with one another if they could. "Of course," Old Nan said. "How would anything ever go wrong if they did not?" Arya, who had slipped out before the septa could even make her twist her hair into a lady's braid, went to Mickon's forge because the smell and the clang spoke to her more sensibly than words about a lady being a vessel did. Mickon had a temper like a lived-in boot. He spat when he was thinking and put the flat of his hand against his own cheek when he was pleased with a thing he made. He nodded at Arya because she was not much to look at while she stood still, but she turned like quick water when she moved, and a smith liked that in anyone who climbed over his benches. "I need a needle," she said, delighted with her own private joke. He snorted. "I'll make you a proper one if your father asks me to." He smacked a piece of iron with the hammer. The flare of light at the edge of each strike made her narrow her eyes. "Until then, I will make you pins while you are watching. A pin can be used 100 ways, and half of those are not wicked." He liked to pretend at being offended with her, as if he were doing his part for Catelyn's peace of mind, but he had given her a little knife once, the kind a man uses to peel apples. She had cut a slice of sausage with it this morning and wiped it clean with a care that made the steel look like a thing she loved. "What is under the god's wood?" she asked him then, because she had not meant to ask, but the question came out of her the way birds come out of hedges if you bump them. "Jon says there is a space under there." Mickon paused with the hammer in the air. He did not drop it. He only held it off the way men hold back a punch half-remembered from a bar brawl. "If there is, it has always been there," he said. "Winterfell is like a layered cake. Men have baked it too many times, and sometimes they leave out a layer by mistake." "Can I go under?" she asked. She was grinning. The smile made her look like herself in a way gentleness did not. "No," he said too quickly. He set the hammer down. "Don't go under some tea. If you don't know what is on top of it." She made a face that would have baffled a hedgehog and then loped off, her cap shoved back hastily so it hung on her ears like a foolish crown. In the yard, she nearly ran into Theon, who caught her by the shoulders and spun her around as one does with a pup, then set her back so that her feet were where they had been, but the world looked different. She stuck her tongue out at him because it always worked. He laughed and let her go, and that was the difference between Theon and a man who would make himself her master. By afternoon, the storm had worn itself sideways. The air went clear for an hour, the way it sometimes does when a window opens in a house full of smoke, and the light sharpened. Ned took that hour for the godswood with Robb and 2 men with spades and rope. Jon found himself there without having been called. Ghost made for the seam with his tail held level, his body like a drawn bow. They pried stones with Luwin's cautious hands and Ned's impatient ones, the 2 methods together making an even thing. The rope they put down into the dark came back warm at the end as if it had dipped in broth. One of the men, a rangy fellow from a far holdfast who had laughter lines that meant nothing more or less than that he laughed often, volunteered, as men will, for the first descent. Ned looked at him for a long moment in a way that made the man's face sober. "A lord should go first into his own house," he said, which was stupid in several ways and true in one. He fastened the rope to his belt and tested it with his weight. Robb stood near him without fidgeting and said nothing. Jon tried to stop his own breath from becoming a gasping thing. "Don't put a foot on anything that looks like it can bear you," Maester Luwin called, which made the guard throw him an incredulous look that the maester ignored. Ned went down with care that was not fear. The rope slid through Robb's hands, and the boy's mouth went white at the edges with the effort he made to control the speed. There is a point in any descent where the ground you have left does not feel like ground any longer, and the ground you are going to does not feel like it will ever be reached. Ned hung there for a heartbeat, and then for 3, and then his boots touched something and he shifted his weight, and there was the little clatter of small stones falling. He turned his head. Light glowed around the mouth like a collar and did not travel far into the space. What Jon saw then was not what Ned saw, and that was the way of families and mysteries. Each man got his own shape of a moment, as if the moment were clay and had taken the print of his hand only. What Ned saw was wall. Old brick, the color of dried blood under dust. Root had wormed through it at places and then petrified. A curve suggested a greater room. There were old shelves along one side where no shelf had any business being. Shelves that the damp had swelled and cracked and then preserved in some unnatural way, the way salt preserves fish, even as it changes the taste. Against the far curve of the wall there was a form shaped like a chest, long as a bench and wrapped in the moldered remains of some cloth. It was that shape that made Ned's hand tighten on the rope. "What do you see?" Robb called down, steady and low. "Something left," Ned said, and felt that answer in his bones before he heard his own voice. "Bring me another candle." The candlelight in that space did not increase with a second flame. It seemed to cling to anything that was near it and refused to go farther. Ned moved toward the chest, his boots whispering in dust. He knelt and set down the candles, one on the floor, one on the shelf that looked like it would take the weight and did. The cloth crumbled when he put a finger to it. Under it was iron banding, flaked with rust in a pattern like old scabs. The lock was the mouth of a black fish, swollen and stuck. He set his hands to the lid and did not pull yet. He looked up, the way men look up in old ruined places as if expecting a ceiling to answer, and saw the hole he had come down through, a bright coin of sky with faces around it. "What is it?" Robb asked. It struck Jon, not for the first time, how Robb's voice was his father's voice but with a new edge, and how soon that edge would carry more weight than any of them had yet given it. An old chest. Ned put his fingers to the grooved lid. "Hold the rope. If it is full of mold, Lord, it should stay there," one of the guards said in a tone that would have been saucy if it were not careful. He had known men stricken by opening old things, like sailors who find a gas bubble under ice and then fall asleep and never wake. "If it is full of mold, we will close it," Ned said. He pulled. The lid gave the way. A man who has held a thing too long relaxes when at last he decides to let it go. A smell came up, hot iron, damp stone, and something else that was neither rot nor oil nor tallow. The maester's candle on the shelf guttered and then held steady. Ned leaned and let his eyes learn the new light. On a bed of ash that had stayed ash without dispersing, 3 ovals lay, each big as a newborn child, each with a skin that was not smooth but scaled minutely, like the belly of some fish he had seen once at White Harbor, brought out of waters no man in the north ever boasted of. One was so dark it ate the light. One was the color of a river stone, green shot with a bruised gold. One was pale, not white like snow, but cream like milk with honey left long on the fire, with veins of some pale blue running through it. They were eggs, of course, and of course they could not be eggs, because what egg lies in a chest under a god's wood through a dozen lifetimes? The air above them was warmer by a hand's breadth than the air in the rest of the chamber. Ned put his palm just above so that he felt heat and not the eggs, and he felt the beat then, not in stone but in the warmth itself. "Bring them up," he said, and he knew he should not have said that. He knew he should say, "Close it, we'll send men who know the ways of old things." He knew a dozen sensible words. He said the one that men in his line had learned to say when a thing that was his came into his hand. "Bring them up." Robb fed the rope and Ned tied knots. The kind sailors showed him long ago when he had been a boy with his first mind toward how things hold. They raised the chest together, Ned pushing from below, the men hauling above. The dust left a pattern along Ned's sleeves that was like armor. John, who had thought he might never touch anything inside the chest, did not move to help until the chest had come high enough that he could slide his hands beneath and take weight from his lord. His hands felt warmth through the iron and the wood. He had never felt warmth like a living thing inside a dead one. He did not say anything because he had learned a few lessons, and that was one. When a thing happens that splits your life into before and after, do not talk until you have to. They set the chest on the path. The steam from the pool drifted. Snow landed and melted on the iron with little sighs. Lewin stood very still and did not reach, which earned John's respect more than many speeches had. Ned bent and drew his fingers along the scaled skin of the dark egg, and he did it with a gentleness that reached back to every cradle he had ever leaned over. He did not pick it up. He only touched, and when he did, the ravens in the rookery, though no one could hear it from here, set up a clacking that was not alarmed and not content and sounded like an argument among men who do not like the shape of joy. "How?" Robb said. It was a real question in a place with no answers. "I do not know," Ned said. He put both hands on the edge of the chest and felt the heat travel up into his bones through his arms. And in that moment he knew nothing except that they should not be left under the sky to drink the snow. "We will put them in my solar." "No." "In the crypts." "No." He was not a man who liked not knowing what to do. He looked toward the towers and the smoke that rose from them and saw in his mind's eye the shape of fire and what fire does to wood and to men. "Maester," he said at last, "what would you do with 3 warm stones?" "Step lightly," Lewin said. He had his hand over his chain. "They look like they should be dead, and they are not." He cleared his throat. "We should put them where heat keeps, so their manner, if it is truly that, does not shock. The room above the hot pools, perhaps. Wrap them in wool. Watch them. And if they crack?" Lewin blinked. "I do not think they will." "What if they do?" The question came out of John before he thought about who should speak. It did not sound like a boy's question in his ears, only like a man's for once, and he did not feel shame for having asked. "Then we will have what is inside," Lewin said, and for all his learning his voice was a breath softer when he said it, like a prayer. They carried the chest between them, for men and 2 boys, as if it were a bier. The path they made through the snow steamed in places where it met the path the hot springs kept bare. The servants who saw them said nothing while they passed and said a great many things when they had gone by. If anyone ran to tell Caitlin, it would not be before she had finished one task, because she did not like hands left idle and had taught even the idle-minded to pretend at work when they went with news. The door to the room above the pools opened with a little catch of swollen wood and then gave as if it had been meant to give on that day. The room breathed like a living thing. Steam hung along the ceiling in a slow sheet and dripped at one edge where some craftsman long ago had set a catch trough to take it. The floor was tiled so that a woman with bare feet would not cry out for the cold. Ned sent for wool and it came, thick bales of it, the good spun kind and the rough unspun, and the women who brought it looked and did not speak because they had sense. He had them set the chest on trestles. He would not have it sit on the wet floor, and layered wool into the bed of ash at the bottom, and then he lifted the first egg and only then understood how heavy it was. The weight was wrong for its size. It was too heavy with a weight not like stone. His hands tightened. He set it on the wool. When he let go, he felt the warmth on his palms like an afterkiss. Robb hovered and would have put his own hand to the second if Ned had not given him a look that said later. He lifted the green-veined one, then the pale. They lay in a row like heads. He layered wool thickly over and around, tucked it as a man tucks a baby in its cradle. He stood over them a long moment. He did not speak. He put the lid back over the chest, laid without pushing it down enough to fasten the lock, and for the first time in many years, he found he did not wish for more knowing than he had. Catelyn came quietly. She could walk like a shadow when she wished to avoid the sound of her own worry on the stones. She stood in the doorway a little while and watched the way the men moved around the chest, the way her husband's hands smoothed wool in a manner that sent memory through her like a knife. The memory of a dark night in a storm at Riverrun when she had tucked Bran into a bed while thunder walked the sky and Ned had said, softly so as not to wake him, "He has all his fingers." The ridiculousness of the remark, its relief. She went forward then and set her hand on the edge of the chest as if to steady it, though it did not need steadying. Heat rose to her palm. Her first thought startled her with its clarity. This is what a living world feels like. Her second followed close and was less welcome. The last time that kind of heat came into a house, it did not go out again without a cost. "What is it?" she asked. "An old thing," Ned said. She knew he would not lie to her. He did not say more because he would not fill a hole with a guess. "We found it under the godswood." "Of course you did," she said before she could stop herself. And if the words had a sharper edge than she intended, she smoothed it with the look she set on his face. "Is it safe?" "No," Arya said from behind her, as if she had been born at the door and had never not been standing there. "Not safe, not yet." She edged nearer. "What's in it?" "It's not a thing for a child," Catelyn said. "I'm not a child," Arya said, a phrase that had done such work in the house as any woman's hands. And for the first time in this house, Catelyn found she could say it might be true of Arya sooner than she had planned. "Can I look?" "Later," Ned said. He laid a hand on Arya's shoulder. "We will learn its manner first." That night, sleep was a cloth laid over the house and it fit badly. The men who usually snored the loudest turned and turned. Those who never stirred made new noises. The ravens kept up a chatter. Jon lay on his pallet and watched the ceiling with the comfortless attention of a man who has a splinter he cannot get from his finger. He got up twice and went to the room with the chest. The guard at the door, a man who had been kind the first winter after Jon had come to Winterfell when the boy had not understood men's silences yet, let him pass without more than the lift of an eyebrow. Jon stood with his hands in his cloak and watched the chest as one watches for a breath at the lip of a dying man's mouth. He did not open it. He did not have to. He could feel the heat from across the room. It smelled of iron and of something like rain on a hearthstone. On his second visit, near dawn, the smell had changed. You know it when it happens even if you do not know what you are smelling. Would smoke and rain both have first breaths? The heat made small sounds as it moved through the wool. The lid twitched, imperceptible if you were not watching. A tremor that ran along the iron band and was done. Jon went to the chest. He set his hands where his father's hands had been. He lifted the lid. The wool had settled. He slid it aside and saw the three. The scales had changed, not much, but enough that he knew he had not imagined it later when others would say all kinds of things. The pale one had a sheen now like the inside of a seashell. The dark one was darker and drank the light like a well. He put a finger to the green veining of the second and felt the faintest give, as if the scale under his finger had loosened and then settled back into its place. He drew back and stood with his fists clenched without realizing he had clenched them. The guard coughed politely behind him and said, "M'lord?" which made John snap the lid down as if he had been caught rifling a coffer. He was no lord. He felt the word like a shoe that did not fit. "Sorry," John said, and meant it and did not. When he left the room, Ghost went with him at a lean, as if the wolf were bracing against something other than the cold. John had just enough sense left in him to seek Ned rather than Robb first. He found his father in the yard with a short cloak thrown over his nightshirt, hair still damp. John told him what he had seen, and there was no call to ask him if he imagined it. Ned knew the flavor of John's truth when he tasted it. They went together. Luwin came when called, hair sticking all ways, eyes that were more awake than the rest of him. Catelyn came too, sensible enough to know that being left out did not make a thing less dangerous. Robb and Arya and, inevitably, Theon trailed like a comet's tail. The guard at the door set his feet wide at the look of them all, and then stepped aside without a word, because there are moments a guard knows he is a stone and stones only hold up what is said on them. Ned lifted the lid. The room breathed. The heat that struck them all at once was stronger than it had been. Luwin leaned over and the chain at his neck clicked softly. The click of the different metals through all his learning sounded to John like bells in a town he had never seen and would not. Catelyn set her hand at the edge of the chest and did not move. The three lay in their nest of wool. The pale one shone as if lit from within. The dark had a line along it, not a crack exactly, but a joint where two scales met and did not lie flush. Ned, who had held babes who came into the world with their shoulders askew, put a fingertip to that place and felt it give the length of a hair. "They are eggs," he said softly, and the word changed the room the way a king's presence changes anything you thought you knew. "They mean to be more." "What else can an egg mean to be?" Arya whispered. It was not impudence. It was wonder. John looked at Ned, and Ned looked at John, and there was something between them then that had nothing to do with names. "We cannot keep this quiet," Catelyn said in a voice that was very even. "You cannot put 3 eggs in a chest in a room above the pools and pretend they are stones. People will smell it. News knows when to grow legs." "What will we say when it asks to be said?" Ned asked. He never liked to borrow trouble, and trouble rarely did him the courtesy of borrowing from him. "That depends on what they are when they are done being eggs," Luwin said. He reached and put a hand near the pale shell, not touching it, and the heat reddened the skin on his fingers as if he had already held it too long. "Fire is not loyal. If they are what they pretend at being, we will need to learn whether they answer to any word men know." They did not have to wait long for that lesson, because that evening the pale egg took a breath. There was no other way to think of it, and a steam like the breath above a horse's nostrils in winter came up from the shell. It did not crack with a sound like stone breaking. It unfolded as if the scales were petals, and under each was another layer that opened petal by petal, and under those a dampness that smelled not like rot, not like a bird's clutch, but like lifted peat and hot iron, and a smell John could not put a name to because he had never stood near a dragon. He did not think of dragons then. He thought of Ghost's first breath when they took the pup from his dead mother. He thought of the sound of his own blood in his ears when he had run too hard in the yard at 13 and fallen into snow and thought he would die from the hurt of a stitch. He thought of a sound he had never heard until now, which was the knife-soft slip of a new life into air. The thing inside came out blind, not from lack of eyes, but from too much world. It lay in a tangle of itself with a long, delicate neck and a head too big for that neck, and small frilled spines lay flat in a row along its back like wet gull feathers. Its wings were pressed tight to its body like a second set of legs folded uncertainly. It was not white. It was the color of pale metal and snow where men walked and left it to freeze again with a crust on the top. Its eyes opened, and the pupils were slits that widened and narrowed as it found the shape of the room, and in their pale irises a color moved and settled like smoke. It opened its mouth. There were teeth there already, a few only needle-bright and as thin as thorns. It made a sound that started in a pitch too high to hear and slid down to something that struck bone. The second egg did not wait long. The green-veined shell split along a line that had not been there, and something darker, the color of old pine bark, came shouldering out of it, much wetter, heavy with the weight of the world's laws breaking off of it. The third, the dark, held, and held longer than Jon could bear, so that he forgot to breathe, and when it opened at last it did so in a spill of heat that made the wool char where it touched. The smell of that charred wool brought a memory up so fast Jon did not have time to brace. He saw a pyre that had never been built, some part of himself standing at its edge holding a torch he had never taken in his hand. It ran over him, bracing and terrible, and was gone. They were small. That was the first thought sensible men had when they found words. The second thought came on the heels of the first and threw it down. Small or not, these were dragons. The books had made them other shapes in Jon's mind. All the monsters in the books were larger, older, already formed. These were too slender in their parts, their legs too fragile, their bodies too long for their size like whipcord under silk. They were beautiful in the way a wasp is beautiful when its wing catches light. Precise and meant. Two of the men who had carried the chest with Ned put hands to their knives without meaning it. The movement made a sound against their belts. The eldest dragon, pale, turned its head toward the sound. It lifted itself, uncertain at first, then with a whip twitch that sent wool sliding. It moved toward Jon in a line so direct that everyone else in the room became, for that moment, a room of furniture. Ghost did not move, came to the chest's edge and stretched its neck, tongue flicking. Jon held out his hand. It came down on his palm, light as a torchbird and heavier than it should be. Both truths at once, and the heat made his skin sting. Its claws pricked his glove and went through to the skin beneath like curiously polite knives. Jon's breath hitched. The dragon's chest rose and fell against his hand. He could feel the beat. It was the beat he had felt in the stone. He did not know anything else and did not look away even when Arya made a little sound and Robb took a half step. The green one had turned its head toward Arya as if the pitch of her breath were a kind of bell. It placed its 4 feet on the chest's rim and drew itself up with a jerk, then unrolled a wing. The wing was a map of light and shadow, veined and stretched, the membrane so thin that when the candlelight hit it you could see the pattern within like a leaf held to the sun. It made a small, questioning sound. Arya, who did not often think before she did, put out her hand as Jon had done and laughed when it stepped onto her fingers and then onto the die of her wrist and then onto her forearm. It dug claws in. She hissed, a small, fierce sound, and tilted her arm to take the weight and spoke to it with a word she thought she had made up as she said it, but which felt older than any word she had learned from Septa Mordane. The Dark One looked at Ned. That was how it seemed to all of them after, when they tried to tell it, each to his own mind's truth. It might have looked at the largest person, or at the center of the room's gravity, or at the tallest candle. It looked at Ned. He did not move to meet it. He stood and let it come, heavy, a weight beyond its little body. Put one foot on the edge of the chest and then drew it back, uncertain, and then it launched all at once and hit his forearm and slipped. His hand closed by instinct around a creature that could have bitten him to bone if it had chosen. He had held slippery boilings of life before in the moments after women's labors, had saved or lost them with pressure alone. He closed and did not crush. It hung there, clinging with small knives in its feet, and looked at him with eyes like shut doors half opened. Theon reached then because Theon always reached. He did it with a good impulse he would later dress in astonishment, which was that a man should know what a thing is by touching it. The green one turned its head toward him while still on Arya's arm. She had not had time to name it yet, but it had had time to decide it was hers. Its mouth opened and the heat that came out of it was not flame but had in it the taste of Flame's father. Theon jerked his hand back with a curse that made Catelyn's mouth flatten and looked at the nick it had left on him. No more than a cook's burn, red and almost pretty, and then looked at Arya with something like wonder. "Well," he said, shaken into honesty, "it seems they've their minds. They've their blood," old Nan said later, when Arya told her every detail while sitting on the old woman's stool with her ankles crossed because she was too excited to sit and too respectful to pace. The old gods like to make their own fun when men have held them out of their houses a long time. She said it in a tone that would have sounded the same if she had said the sky sometimes drops snow, which made it more alarming and more comforting in equal measure. What lay after that first hour was not a day but a pattern. You set patterns faster than you know when a new life comes into a house. The dragonlings slept and woke and ate and made messes that had to be cleaned with water, heated to a very particular warmth or the smell would set into the wool, and they thirsted and had to be taught not to bite the bucket lip. Maester Luwin kept notes that he pretended were simply notes. He weighed the remnants of shell and set aside scales that came loose when they moved, and he burned what came away from the little bodies. He did not say why in any words all the children could hear. Ghost lay at the room's build edge and watched through half-closed eyes the way a dog watches a field where lambs run. Robb did whatever he was asked without being asked twice, and in spare moments he stood with his hand against the wood of the chest and thought too much and said too little. Ned learned the way to lift each small thing without fear. Catelyn learned the particular line her mouth took when she was keeping her fear folded and hidden because to set it out would only make it worse. Sansa stood at the threshold with excitement that made her glow and did not enter. She watched Arya with the green one and Jon with the pale and her father with the dark and thought of songs that had dragon queens and kings in them and could not decide if she should be glad or afraid to be so near to a song. She came closer once, when the green turned its head toward her, and then stepped back because its eye slid over her and did not catch, and she did not like that feeling at all. Later she stood in the Septa's chamber and took a deep breath and let herself imagine being at court, wearing silk red enough to match a dragon's eye, and said nothing to her sister because she did not have a word she could use that would not sound foolish and small. By the third day, the pale one, Jon's, had found a way to make a breath of heat that scorched a strip of cedar laid near its mouth. A little sigh of light that was not yet aflame. The smell of scorched cedar went through Jon like the smell of leather after storm, and he found himself smiling and then scrubbed the smile away as if it were dirt he had picked up from kneeling in the yard. The dragon flicked a tongue along his skin. He did not draw away, though the heat bit him a bit like a cold day does if you keep your hand in a snowbank too long. "You," he whispered to it, and he did not put a name to it yet, because you do not name a thing until you are sure what the name will do to it. "What do you think they want?" Robb asked him that night in the corner of the great hall. Their heads bent together as if they were still small enough that men would take them for children and leave them be. "To live," Jon said simply. It was the answer that met every creature in every season. To be warm, to hunt, to fly. He said the last word and felt the shape of it in his mouth as if he had bitten something fresh and tart. He looked up at the empty air above the hall's rafters. If he were a different boy in a different house, he might have said, "One day I will fly too." He said nothing. He pressed his heels against the leg of the bench until it hurt. When Ned went to the crypts that night, he did not carry a candle. He walked in the dark and let the hall's remembered turns take him. It was a way of trust to let the stones bring you where you were going when you could not see. He stopped before his sister's statue, as he had done 1,000 times, and listened as if there might be an answer. "If this is yours," he said into the carved stone smell, "I will do as I am able." The words were strange from him. He did not make bargains with gods or with ghosts. He stood a long time, and when he went up, he was warmer than he had been when he went down, though he had not touched the pools. The morning after that, word came from one of the watchmen along the outer wall that there had been a light in the Godswood after midnight that was not a torch and not the falling of a star. The man had not stirred from his post to go to it because his post was his post, and Ned, who had worn the post of being a man with other men's lives to consider, did not call him a coward. He stood on the walk in the cold and looked toward the Godswood and saw only what one always sees: a tangle of bark and memory, white bark under snow, red leaves like tongues holding their color where none else did. He felt in his bones the shape of events he could not yet name. He did not call a council. He did not send a raven. He went to the room above the pools and stood in the steam and held the dark one in his hands until it slept. On the 5th day, something that might have been a laugh and might have been a growl came from Theon when he held out a strip of salted pork, and the green one took it from him and then turned its head away and would not take another, and Arya said, "He doesn't trust you," without malice and with a sort of joy that shamed Theon in a way he had not expected. "He trusts me," she added, and the dragon made a little hiss that was less a warning than a word, as if it had learned the shape of that thought and was reminding them both of it. Theon bowed, extravagantly, to something that could fit into a woman's saddlebag and would as easily have taken his fingers off if it had cared to. "My lady," he said, and Arya rolled her "e." Yes, but could not keep her mouth from curving. By the end of that first week, there were fewer secrets left in Winterfell's old stones. Stewards know everything before lords do or pretend they do. The women who brought the wool told cousins who told husbands who told friends. The boy who carried the empty pails told the girl who milked in the evenings, and she repeated it to the sons of the man who kept the pigs as if the news had been a story that might make the night go faster. Words ran through the house like mice and gathered to nests in the corners. And when they squeaked too loudly, Ned put his foot down and said they would not send a raven yet. The words did not need wings before they knew what to carry. In the rookery, Maester Luwin kept his hands clean and his notes dated and pretended for one more day that the world could be held still by caution. In the Godswood, the seam lay shut and snow covered it in a soft plain again. And if there were still a beat there, it was deep enough now that only earth heard it. The old faces on the weirwood watched all of it with the same long, patient look that had unnerved Catelyn since the first time she had come here as a bride and found it staring at her as if she were unimportant. That night, when the candles were down and most men slept, Jon returned to the room. Ghost went before him and lay outside the door with his head on his paws. Jon entered and closed the door behind him quietly. He took the pale one out from the chest and set it on the trestle table where rolls of wool and a wooden bowl made a small landscape. It flicked its tongue along the back of his hand again, and he felt laughter and grief tug both in his chest. The same old companions, a pair of wolves that had fought there as long as he had thoughts, and neither had ever quite killed the other. He went to the window and pushed the shutter wide, and cold air rolled in at him like a wave, and he stood in it because sometimes you stood where two weathers met and it made you feel more yourself. The pale dragon climbed the scarp of his arm and made a place on his shoulder, and he turned his face toward the Godswood. He did not think a prayer or a promise. He simply stood there with a new weight and looked out over the white. He felt then, very faintly, the presence of the old things in the stone, not as words, not as faces, not even as the beat he had felt in the ground, but as a kind of attention that you can mistake for your own if you are lonely enough. He was not lonely at that moment. He only understood that something saw him and was not displeased. Morning came with a crispness that snapped in the air the way a banner will sometimes snap in a wind that has no reason. Ned called Luwin before the household had entirely shaken sleep off and said, "We must teach them to obey." It was a ridiculous sentence in many ways, as if anyone had ever taught fire, and Luwin raised one eyebrow the way he did when he was too tired to gather a full frown. "They have already chosen," Luwin said, and then because he could not leave a thought as poetry when he could make it into sense, he added, "We can make them know us. That is as much as any beast does. They know you by scent and hand and voice. They can find you in the dark. We will teach them words," Ned said, half to see whether he could make such a thing be true by saying it. "They will answer to us." He did not say to whom that meant. He did not say whether Theon counted. He did not say what he suspected, that the dragons would answer to the blood that had carried the north through winter after winter with a stubbornness that was not virtue so much as refusal. He did not say that he had named no daughters in that thought, and then he looked at Arya, who stood with the green thing wrapped along her arm, and changed his mind and said to himself that it was House Stark and that meant all of them. He found words. Men always do. They began with simple sounds, the second syllable of a name, the lifted sound of a command that makes sense to any dog, and the dragons listened with their entire bodies the way creatures do who have only been in the world a short time and do not yet know which sounds matter more than others. The pale one came to Jon when he said a word that was almost no word at all, a sound he had always made when he wanted Ghost. He made it softer and the dragon learned it as quickly as a newborn learns the smell of milk. The green followed Arya's barest whistle. The dark turned its head when Ned's voice went low and level, the way his voice went when he said men's names to them at the moment right before mercy or punishment. The first time Ned tried to call the dark dragon from the chest to his wrist, it paused at the edge and looked toward Catelyn. It was a small thing, and it made no sense at all, and Catelyn did not like the prick the glance left in her chest. She did not think herself cowardly. She had slept with knives in the room and men who were nearly knives standing at the foot of her bed when times were bad. She did not think herself slow. She had learned this house and all its ways fast enough to keep from losing her children to it in those first years when grief lay everywhere like a cloth over furniture. But this was fire, and fire always reached for the nearest dryness. She kept her hands at her sides and did not offer them. They brought the dragons, one by one, to the God's Wood. It was Arya's idea, and it was a good one that came in the way Arya had of good ideas. Sudden and without regard for permission, and no one stopped her quickly enough to keep it from becoming the day's plan. They were under the roots, she said, and the way she said it made all of them feel as if it mattered what the trees thought. The trunks stood white, the red faces looking, the branches bare except where red leaves clung with a doggedness that snow could not persuade them out of. They set the chest on a stone and opened it. Steam drifted through the God's Wood as if a spring had run a finger along the air and made it see itself. The dragons lifted their heads and drew breath and made little sounds that were not the sounds they made in the room above the pools. They were quieter. They moved more slowly. They looked not afraid and not bold, but something else. A cool attention that made Jon's heart run faster because he recognized the kind of look it was. It was the way he had felt in this place since he was small. The sense that the place was not his and that it did not mind him anyway. The pale dragon turned toward the weirwood. It set one foot down and then another, high-stepping because the snow tickled its belly and it did not like that new sensation, and then it pressed its nose to the bark. It drew back, sneezed. A ridiculous little sound that made Rickon clap his hands once, and then be silent again when Catelyn's hand tightened on his shoulder, and pressed again. His tongue flicked. The bark steamed for a moment under the touch. The red sap that oozed slowly from one of the face's carved eyes made a bead like a jewel. The green one came alongside it and splayed its little wing on the trunk, as if it would make itself larger to the tree. The dark hung back a moment and then came as if it had decided it had had enough of its siblings being bold without it. All three pressed their small warm bodies to the weirwood and then drew back and turned as one toward Ned. It was a small turning, and it made the world inside Jon's chest open like a door onto a wind. "If anyone else comes near them," Theon said under his breath, and for once not with any intent to be heard. "Will they?" "They will," Robb said without heat. He did not say what he meant. He did not need to. Theon nodded, and the nod was not submission and not agreement exactly. It was the kind of nod a man gives another man when he has understood where not to set his foot if he wants to keep both legs. The news reached the winter town in the way news leaps across walls. A woman who washed clothes in the hot pools for coin told her sister who baked oatcakes, who told her husband who kept a masterless dog for its bark and not its bite, who told the man who bought his stale ends to brew stout in a way that made men's stomachs warm, who told a tanner who had done a favor for a guard last summer. By the time it reached the last house before the smithy, it had grown horns and wings and teeth, which was more accurate than much that ran. Men took it in stride as men do in a country where weather kills you as often as men do. They pulled their cloaks tighter and considered whether the price of oats would go up if dragons took to eating them, and carried on. The children ran the alleys with arms out and blew steam out of their mouths to make pretend smoke until their mothers told them to knock it off. A week older and the dragonlings began to test the air with their wings and to make hops that would be flights, and Maester Luwin carefully did not say, out loud, that the roof in the room above the pools would not bear the leaps they were beginning to dream of. Ned set men on strengthening things, as if one could nail down a world and make it hold. He set the chest not on trestles but on a new-built table that had its legs joined with pegs instead of iron fastenings, because the smith explained something about wood and heat to him that he understood only enough to respect. He sent for hides from a cousin's holding and for certain old books from Winterfell's smaller store, and he sat at night with a single candle and a face that made Catelyn put her hand on his hair and not say what rose to her tongue. On the 12th day, at dawn, Jon took Ghost to the east wall to watch the light come up thin and pink. The pale dragon rode his shoulder, claws gripping into the thick wool so that Jon had to walk more carefully than he was accustomed. The wind off the bay had no mercy and some delight in showing it. His ears burned. His cheekbones went numb. His eyes watered and then froze at the corners so that tears became a kind of armor. He leaned against the merlin and did not mind the cold cut of it. He liked the way the wall bit his back like a reminder that he was going to be here a long time. The pale dragon stretched its neck and opened its mouth. A breath of steam came out and vanished in the greater breath of Winterfell. Far off, a band of sun rose above the sea, and the light struck the dark shapes of the wolfswood and slid along the roofs of the winter town like a hand, and it fell on the godswood with a hush. Jon felt the hush in his mouth like a coin he could not swallow. Below, in the yard, Robb called men to their marks with a voice that carried, and somewhere a woman laughed and then put her hand quickly over her mouth because laughter felt like breaking a rule when the day is holy, and you do not know yet why it is holy, but you know not to laugh. The pale dragon rubbed its jaw against his neck, a cat-like motion that was too hot and not rough enough. He put his hand up and felt the fine, hard line of its spine, and for a moment the world stepped aside and let him through a door he had not seen. He saw just the barest shadow of a shape, a sky with something under him instead of above him, and the wind not at his face but everywhere, and the thought of it made his skin come alive. The dragon made a sound like a string's low note. He swallowed. He looked into the winter's mouth and said nothing. He set his free hand on Ghost's head. The wolf's fur took the warmth of the dragon's heat into it and held it for a second. Jon did not know what name to give that second. He did not know a name for this feeling at all. Jon. Ned's voice came from the stair behind him. Jon turned. He always turned when Ned said his name because names in Ned's mouth had weight. Ned was wrapped only in a cloak. He did not dress himself in fear to come out here. He came to stand with Jon and put high as hands on the wall as Jon had. He looked out and then only briefly looked at the thing on Jon's shoulder. "You are careful." "I try," Jon said. "Try and do," Ned said. He was silent a long while. The pale dragon tracked the movement of his mouth, and when he spoke again it watched his throat. "There will be a day when men will come and ask to see these." He did not have to say what men. Jon thought of kings and of men who thought themselves near enough to kings to have their tricks and not their responsibilities. "I will have to show them." "I know," Jon said. That was a surprise too. He had not put words to it yet. The world had already done so. "They won't take them." He did not say it as a hope or a wish. He said it as a word of the same weight as the wall. The pale dragon had shifted. Its claws dug in not painfully, only insistently. Ghost's ears pricked at a sound below them. The yard called. The day called. The north called. All of those calls were old. The new one came from the small, hot weight on his shoulder. He set his hand on it lightly. It lifted its head and took his touch the way a friendly man takes a greeting in a hall, without surprise and as if it were meant. "Keep that in your head," Ned said. He put a hand on Jon's other shoulder, the one without heat, and squeezed once. "Keep your sense. Keep your place." "I know my place," Jon said, which was both a lie and the only thing he could say if he meant to become more than the place men had made for him when he came into the world. "It may change," Ned said. He was not given to prophecy and did not commit one now. He only spoke as a man who had watched boys become men and fail sometimes and rise other times, and had had his own place taken from him and remade twice. He stood there until his eyes watered and dried and watered again. He set his jaw then in a way that made Jon's heart pull. "Come," he said, and the day came with them down the stairs. That noon, a fire was laid in the great hall, not because the day was colder than any other day that week, but because a hall with dragons in it, even in a chest, even small ones, asks for a fire as a matter of respect. Men ate and said small things to one another because big things go better in small words. Catelyn sat with Sansa beside her and a headache pressing at the edges of her vision, and she thought of Riverrun, which had often come like a song to her head when the North made a boys' game of everything. She looked at Arya, who had her elbow on the table and was catching the last bit of soup with a bit of bread like a peasant, and at Robb, who was speaking to one of the men-at-arms with seriousness. She looked at Jon and the way he kept his shoulders from hunching, as if he could make himself less if he tried that hard. Old Nan, at the lower end, told a story when the men had had enough beer to stand a story. She told of a winter that had lasted 3 years, and of a man who had brought a coal from a city far to the south to keep his hearth burning, and had killed his neighbor rather than let him warm his hands there. She told it as cautionary tale and as plain record, and had the sense not to make it a sermon in a hall where men were full of meat. She said, "Fire eats," and then, to balance it because she always did, "And so does cold, and so do men's hearts." And then she clacked her tongue and said, "Eat while the bowl is in front of you," and they laughed. Toward the end of that day, when the sun had sunk and the yard took on a kind of light that comes from the snow itself, a raven came to the rookery with a barbed talon and a note that had 2 broken seals and no wax on it any longer. It had flown through weather that had pulled at it and kept flying. Maester Luwin took the message with a caution you reserve for snakes. He read it, and then he read it again, and then he went to find Ned and said, "There is word from the south." Ned took it with the care men take when their children sleep in the room and they have to move around them to light the fire. He read and breathed and read again. He did not take that into the room above the pools. He folded it in half and then in fourths and then again, as if the paper could be made by folding to fit into a smaller truth. He went to Caitlin and handed it to her, and she read, and then she looked at him and understood why he had not come straight to the chest and set the words there. Some messages do not belong near heat. When the rains in the south have their way, they bring things up from the earth that should not have been brought up. So does news. But that was a matter for another hour. In this hour, in this house, with the snow falling and the dragons drinking warm goat's milk from little bowls as if the world had always meant them to, a family stood at the edge of a change the way a man stands at the edge of a river with a thin skin of ice he can break with his boot or not. John looked at the pale dragon's small talon curved around the rim of the bowl. He listened to the sound of the weirwood creaking as wind passed through the red leaves. He put his hand out and the dragon stepped onto it. He did not know whether the gods had made him for this for him or neither. He knew only that when he said the soft sound he had made for Ghost and now made for this new thing, it turned toward him, and in its hot, precise weight there was a promise he could feel in the bones of his hand. He did not yet know what the promise was. He only knew it was there, and he found that enough for a beginning. The paper rasped when Ned unfolded it again, though he had already read and reread the words until they had settled on his bones. Maester Luwin's neat hand had added a note beneath the royal seal where the wax had split. "We should strengthen the hinges on the rookery box against wet." This came in soaked, as if the maester could not keep himself from tidying even grief. "John Arryn dead," said the hand he knew as Robert's. "Even through the formality, the king means to ride north to Winterfell with all his household. Be ready to receive him as befits our love and our long years." Another hand had added, cramped and sharp as a man's voice when his breath runs short, "Within a fortnight." He held the paper as if it had weight enough to anchor all the things that had begun to float loose since the chest under the gods would have been opened. "Robert," he said, and the name brought a dozen faces into the room at once. A boy with a gap-toothed grin, a young lord with a hammer too heavy for his hand and rage lightning him, a king whose knock on his door had sounded like a promise and a threat both. Caitlin watched him with the careful attention she used when there was meat to be carved and knives and children near at hand. Lantern light ran along the edge of her hair and turned the copper to iron. "Will you tell the household?" "In an hour." He folded the letter again, smaller and smaller until it fit inside itself. A trick a man learns when he has to carry too much in too little space. He looked toward the door that led to the room above the pools. A faint thread of heat bled through the wood as if breath had learned to pass through oak. "And them," he added, though it was not a thing that needed saying. "When Robert sees them," Caitlin said. She did not make it a question. She held his eyes and did not tap her fingers as she sometimes did when attention wanted to gallop. "He must not," Ned said too quickly. The room seemed to draw closer, as if it meant to put a hand on each of his shoulders and press until his thoughts slowed. "Not yet. You cannot hide a blaze with your cloak," she said. "You can turn so it warms your back. That is all." He went to her and took both her hands in his because he had learned that sometimes sense made more headway when it had a body with it. "Robert hates dragons," he said. The words were a plain fence anyone could see. "He has reason to. He will not ask whose they are. He will only see what they are and strike. He will call them Targaryen things, whatever we say." Caitlin had never seen King Robert except in her wedding tales of her sisters. He lived in her mind as a sum of what Ned had not said as much as what he had. "And this is the North. It is." He let her hands go and rubbed his thumb along his palm, feeling the scar from a practice blade that had slipped 30 years ago and had taught him the only lesson men remember from a cut, that flesh parts easily. "We will keep them close. There are places here that belong to us and to no one else. In the crypts," She did not mean to be sharp. The word came with a flake of ice in it anyway. They are not creatures for the dark. No, he saw the shape of them in that long hall among stone wolves and felt a wrongness he did not have to clothe in words. The room above the pools is best. Steam keeps their heat from being strange to the air. We limit the hands that go there. We bind the tongues we must bind. You will be asking people with no stakes in kings to keep secrets that will feel like treason when the king stands in the yard. She shook her head once, a hard, small motion. If you mean to do this, do it with clean edges. Tell them what is asked and why. Remind them who they are. Starks, he said, not as boast but as prayer. Luwin, he added, as if the maester could be summoned by naming him. And Rob, John, the children. She laid a hand on his arm when he spoke John's name, not to stop him, only to acknowledge that she had heard it and set it aside for later, as housewives do a bit of gristle, kept, not thrown, to flavor a soup when the pot is thinner than it ought to be. He gathered them in the solar where the light fell across the maps in a way that always made him want to run his hands along the lines of rivers. Rob stood straight, as if someone had warned him that a spine could be read like a banner. Arya fidgeted and caught herself at it and stilled, and then forgot and fidgeted again. Sansa folded her hands until the skin went pale along her knuckles. Bran leaned against the edge of the table with a possessive affection for wood and parchment that made Ned's mouth soften. Rickon tugged at Catelyn's sleeve until she lifted him to her hip. Jon kept near the window, the pale dragon curled back at his collarbone. Small head tucked as if asleep. Ghost lay like a coil of frost at Jon's boots and looked up only once, when Ned said Robert's name. Maester Luwin came with his chain clinking in a homely way, and Theon lounged in a place that looked like ease and was always an argument. Jon Arryn is dead, Ned said. The words made a space around themselves and filled it. Rob's jaw clenched. Sansa's breath caught and smoothed itself at once. Arya's eyes flicked around the faces and rested on her father's. The king rides north. He will be here within a fortnight. He let his eyes pass over all of them. He did not let them rest anywhere too long because that made people brace. He will come with his court. Ser Jaime, Theon said with a little twist to his mouth that could have been admiration and could have been mockery. And the queen, and all the mouths of King's Landing. Yes. Ned held him with a level look. Theon's gaze dropped or did not, depending on who told the tale later. We will receive them as Winterfell receives kings. We will do it well. He paused, and the pause thickened into a silence that he knew would make them hold their breaths. There is this as well. The king cannot know of what we found under the godswood. Sansa's eyes flared, bright, and then dimmed, like a candle when a draft licks it. Arya leaned forward so far Catelyn put her hand on the girl's sleeve. Rob's mouth opened and shut. Jon did not move at all. The dragon stirred, just a ripple along its flanks like wind along a piece of silk hung to dry. If he sees them, Ned said, he will fear them and he will hate them. He will call them rebellion or witchery or worse. He will call them a threat. He is a man before he is a king, and he is my friend before he is a man. But he is also the hammer that broke a dynasty, and he will not leave fire alive in a house that is not his. What if we say they are wolves? Arya said with a sudden grin she could not contain. Rob's shoulder brushed hers. She sobered at his glance and set her teeth in her lower lip because she had not meant to make light of a thing her father made heavy. We will say nothing, Catelyn said before Ned could shape a reply. She had the knack of setting a cloth over a table while hands were still reaching for it. We will act as if there is nothing to say. We will bring them out only where the eyes belong to us. Jon's gaze moved toward her then and flicked away. The pale dragon's eyelids slid open and closed. Luwin nodded. We'll limit those who attend them. No one enters that room without leave. I will set a boy I trust at the stair. Boys know who passes and who lingers. They'll grow, Theon said, and there was something in it of warning and of reluctant delight. You cannot keep them under a lid like a pot forever. We will keep them as long as we must, Ned said, and there was iron in the words that made Theon glance away again. When the time is right, we will decide what to do where men can see. Rob stepped nearer the table. We should drill more on the walls, twice a day until the king comes. Keep the men too tired to gossip. He turned to Maester Luwin and set the carpenters to work repairing the east rampart where the ice took it. I would not have the queen look at a broken place and have cause for remark. You think as a lord, Luwin said, and the words had only gentle pride in them. I will see to it. Ned looked to Sansa. Septa Mordain will need your help. The queen notices what a woman has on more closely than what any man says. Let her find herself answered in what she sees. Sansa's chin lifted. I will make Winterfell beautiful, she said, and though it would have sounded vain in almost any other mouth and day, here it sounded like a vow. Arya? Ned said, and she brightened before the next words made her shoulders sink. You will help your sister. I'll carry, she said quickly, forestalling worse duties. And fetch and not scowl when the queen treads on my toes. She avoided looking at Sansa and earned an almost smile from her sister for that. Jon, Ned said last, saving the hardest for last. The habit was in him the way a scar is in skin. Jon's eyes came to his. They were not black like the legends put on men like Jon. They were gray. You will keep to the room as much as you are able. Ghost with you. You will not be seen with yours. He did not say the word he could not say in this room. If you are called, you will answer. If the king asks you a question, you will answer it with courtesy. You will say nothing of what is not asked. Jon nodded once. Yes. The dragon lifted its head and opened its mouth without sound. Ghost's ear flicked. Good. Ned lifted his hand and let it fall. We get to work. We do our duty. We keep what is ours. Work spread through the castle like hot water through a cold basin, pressed into every corner by hands that knew how to make themselves busy. Men climbed and hammered and took measure with their eyes as much as with string. Women laid out cloth and cut and mended and cut again. Children ran errands with breath tearing at their lungs because they would not admit they were winded. The dragon's room became, by necessity, a place apart, the corridor to it watched by men who could be trusted to notice without remark and to remark without noise. Mikken was set to making a low rail to keep the dragonlings from tumbling from the trestle when enthusiasm outran their new-won balance. He worked with a look on his face that made Arya stand and watch him longer than she had intended. It was the look of a man making something he will not be able to explain to himself later. The days took on a rhythm that made hours go by without men noticing they had done so. Morning. Steam and the smell of boiled milk and damp wool being turned, and careful hands cleaning old ash from new scales that came away like fingernail parings. Midday. A walk, if it could be called that, to the gods' wood, wrapped in thick cloth lest any curious servants I catch the telltale shine and line of something that was not dog or cat. The gods would took them in the way it takes any creature that moves softly and does not demand to be answered. The dragons pressed themselves against bark that had watched more winters than any of their bearers would see, and they breathed little puffs that left the bark rimed and then wet. They came when called with a sound that was not a word and not a whistle and more precise than both. Evening. Long, slow watches while the castle's noise fell away and was replaced by a different noise, the soft crackle of scales tightening as they dried from washing, the occasional hiss when a claw caught on wood, the faintest cheep that still somehow found its way into marrow and made the ear turn. Maester Luwin set quills to paper and wondered if any of what he was writing would be a help to anyone, or whether it was only his way of keeping his hands from clutching at mysteries like a covetous man. He weighed the scraps of shell on a scale that had served to measure spice and saw that weight pricked up day by day as if the memory of what had once protected them grew, which was madness, and then declined as the days wore on. He counted the number of breaths they took in a quarter hour at rest and at play. He made a note, almost shamefaced, of the way the pale one turned its head toward a voice like Jon's and only to that voice, even when the timbre was imitated by Theon, who laughed at himself and then did not try again for a time. He noted that the dark recognized Eddard's footstep of 3 men who wore boots cut by the same cobbler. He wrote the names of ancestors in the margins for no reason he could have defended in any hall of logic, and the ink dried there into a litany of the dead Brandon, Ricard, Cregan, Arsa, Baron, like crumbs of prayer he had dropped from a full mouth. One afternoon, Benjen Stark came in out of the wind like a man who had been carved by it. He wore black that had been mended often and cleanly, and his beard was crusted in salt at the edges where the dried frost had left a taste of the sea on it. He swung down from his horse with the easy care of a man who treats animals as equals when there is danger in the yard. He took Ned in his arms like a younger brother and laughed, and then the laugh went out of him in the way laughter does when a room full of worry makes itself known. "They tell me you have wolves in your cellars and fire on a leash," he said when they were alone and passed the cup between them, not touching the heavy topics until the first swallow had made its warm track down their throats. "Who tells you?" Ned said, though he was not truly asking. "Wind, crows, boys who run faster than men think they can and talk twice as fast at the end. Nothing with a name." Benjen looked toward the corridor that led to the room above the pools. "I will not bring the words to the wall until there is a need. It has ghosts enough without new ones." "Come," Ned said. There was relief in being able to say the word out loud to someone who already knew what it meant. "See what my house has done to itself." Benjen stood just inside the threshold and took in the heat and the steam and the smell that he would not have been able to place if his life had depended on it. He stood long enough that the dark dragon's head lifted where it lay and turned toward him like a candle flame that leans when a door is opened. Benjen half smiled and half bared his teeth. A winter look. He put out a hand. "I'm no lord," he said to it without knowing why he spoke words to something that could not understand. "I'm a Stark." It came foot over foot, with the certainty of a creature who has never yet been refused anything it had sense to ask for. It stepped into his palm and the heat knifed through the hard pad of skin there and made him hiss with delight and pain. It clung with little pinpricks that might have bled if he had held it longer. It nosed along his thumb and then lifted its head to look him in the eyes. "Ha!" Benjen said under his breath. "So it is true. The wall?" Ned asked almost without meaning to. "Have you seen?" "No White Walkers," Benjen said. He did not sit. He stood like a man who might have to run. "Not with these eyes. I haven't gone as far as I'd like. Men who have not come as far back. We have dead things that don't lie quiet when cold sets into them. We have bands of wildlings that run thin and desperate and mean. That is enough to fill a man's night without adding ghosts." He let the dragon step off his hand onto the back of the chair, and it scrabbled and found purchase along the carved wolf's head. "If there are old things waking, brother, it seems you have one of the waking in your own house." "They chose us," Ned said, and the simple statement steadied him as much as it unsettled him. "They smell your blood," Benjen said, practical. "They know a home that has kept the same face long enough for wind and snow to know it." He turned, eyes narrowing. "You will not take them south. I mean to do the king his honor." Ned moved a hand as if to wave away his own thought and then set his palm on the table, the gesture a compromise between impulse and habit. "I do not mean to give him everything I own in myself." Benjen's mouth quirked. "He will ask for what belongs to him," he said, "as kings do who forget what belongs to no man." He looked at the small creatures on their wool like a man looking at embers in the last hour before dawn. "If the wall has reason to call, I'll send to you, Ned. And if you need a place to keep something the South would burn, you could do worse than stone and ice under the care of old vows." "Not yet," Ned said. He saw the picture then. A dark creature against cleaner darkness, smoke coiling and caught by the drafts in the passage. A door of rough boards shutting a small heat away from a great cold. He did not like it. He let the picture go. Bran came to the room more often than anyone but Jon and Arya and Ned and the Maester. He had an air about him now as if the castle stones knew his footstep and moved their edges to bear him because he did not make them feel foolish by falling. He spoke to the dragons without speaking. That is, he leaned and put his face near their faces and they leaned as well, and the little mirror of that made him light with a pride he did not need to carry to show. He stood one day on the rail Mikken had made, balanced with his toes curled over the edge just enough to remind his body that edges exist, and held the pale dragon on one hand and the green on the other, and when they unfurled their wings at the same time, the air moved around his wrists in a way that tickled. "I'll build them something," he told Arya later, serious as a steward. A place to perch that will let them feel the air without the roof being angry about it. He begged lengths of rope from men whose rope was dearer to them than coin, and stole a length of washing line from a woman who wept with laughter when she found him with it and guessed his purpose and gave him a better piece in exchange and a kiss on the top of his head. He carried wood under one arm and twined through his fingers and looked down on the yard from places he should not, measuring with his eye in the way bookish men measure with devices. He made a frame of saplings that could be set over the steaming pool, high enough that a man could walk under it without stooping, and then he begged a length of old sail from a man who had ailed in his youth and kept a rag of it for luck. The sail hung from the frame like a second sky. The first time he brought the dragons to it, they looked up and made sounds that made Arya dance in place because she could not help it. They climbed the ropes with their claws as if they had been born to it and then let go, falling with an exuberant confidence that terrified and delighted every watcher at once, and snapped their wings out, the membranes catching and filling and holding for a heartbeat, for two, for three. They landed badly and rolled and lay with their ribs heaving and their mouths open, and then they struggled up and did it again. Mikken stood with his hands on his hips and grunted approval in the way he did when pride made him shy. Maester Luwin remembered and did not say a word about apparatus he had seen in a book from Ashai because he did not mean to dress the North's good sense in foreign clothes. Catelyn watched from the edge with a hand against her throat and did not call out when a wing caught a rope and sent the green into a tumble that ended in a stunned hush and then an angry hiss. Arya scooped it up without fuss and set it back, and the dragon shook itself and leaped again as if neither one of them had a memory that day longer than a heartbeat. Jon's pale one learned to twist in the air and come back to his hand in a curve that made Bran's mouth fall open the first time he saw it. The dark went higher when Ned stood near and did not go as high when he did not. That detail went into Luwin's notes with a satisfaction that he could not justify and did not attempt to. Sansa came less often, but when she did she came with a kind of steady curiosity that sat better on her than fear had. She had learned, as ladies do, how to make her face say what needed saying when a hall watched. Alone, though one was never alone where there were dragons. She let the face be something else. One afternoon she brought a strip of soft leather she had braided herself. "For a collar," she said, and then bit the inside of her cheek because it sounded foolish, naming something collar that would be beyond any collar a person might make for it one day. Jon took it and looped it gently around the pale's neck, not tightening it, only letting it lie there so that the creature could learn the feel of a thing against its throat. It tolerated it for as long as he held its attention and then seized the leather in small needle teeth and tugged until it came free, and then shook it in a way that made Sansa press her lips together not to laugh lest laughter feel like disrespect. "He is vain," she said, surprised at herself for saying anything at all aloud about what a dragon was. "He wants nothing that is not himself. They're all vain," Theon put in, strolling by at the wrong moment as he always did. "Like girls and princes." He tossed the leather back as the pale snapped at it, hand quick. The dragon's teeth grazed him. He swore under his breath and held the reddening crescent with a look that was half to Arya and half to the beast and all to his own unsettled pride. "Little lords bite," he said, masking hurt. "We should have guessed." "Don't tease him," Arya said, protective, and then, because she liked the feel of being listened to by a creature that did not listen to anyone else, she made the small click in her mouth she had taught the green to answer. It turned, and she smiled, and when she looked up her eyes met Sansa's and they shared, without meaning to, the kind of look sisters sometimes have when the world reminds them that it has room for both of them. In quiet moments when the room had only the breathing of the house in it and no step coming up the stair, Jon sat with the pail curled in the hollow of his hands and watched heat make little shimmers in the air above its skin. He spoke to it the way he spoke to Ghost when there was no one else in the yard. He said what he could not say to men. He told it how the yard felt when Rob's laugh hit him like a thrown apple, unexpected and easy and bruising. He told it how the crypt smelled and how that smell made a calm come over him that could be mistaken for sorrow. He told it he did not know what name would fit it, and he tried names out in a whisper, snowflakes, metal, words from old Nan's tales, the names of past winters that had killed men in their beds, and none of them sat just right. The dragon cocked its head at some and closed its eyes at others, and once it pressed its jaw against his thumb when he said a name that had been a ghost's in one of Nan's stories, and he laughed once, soft. "All right," he said. "Not that one then." Ghost lifted his head, opened his mouth in a silent pant that looked like a grin, and set his muzzle against Jon's knee, and Jon felt one heartbeat through the direwolf's bone, another from the dragon, and his own trying to keep time, and for a moment it was as if his chest had more room in it than it had the day before. Dark, practical matters rose with the steam as days gathered. How much meat? How often? Mikken made iron dishes that could be set near the hottest part of the pool, so that a man did not have to hold his hands too near the little licks of heat the pail was beginning to make when amusement or irritation shook it. Leatherman Colin, whose wife had once slapped Arya for taking a rind from a table before she was done, and who had wept later in the alehouse because he had not raised his hand fast enough to keep his firstborn from wandering into the millstream, brought strips cured in a way that meant the fat would melt just so when a small tongue touched it. "The smell of it will bring every boy within a mile," he warned, smiling through his embarrassment at being part of a thing that needed men's care and not only men's work, and the warning proved only half a jest. Robb said a watch. The boys watched and learned to watch without being watched learning, which was as useful a lesson as any in a house where kings were coming. Old Nan told Arya, and then anyone who sat long enough with her to be caught, of a time when a Stark woman had brought a coal from the belly of the earth, red as the heart of a berry, and had carried it in a bucket of wet sand and had set it under the bed of a baby who had not warmed since he came into the world, and the baby had lived, and the coal had cooled into a stone that was too light to be a stone, and had been set into a brooch that women wore on midwinter as a charm against colds in the chest. "We are not the first to think ourselves the first," she said, and though she spoke as if the words were meant to humble, Arya heard instead of lifting. Other women had done what needed doing in the cold, and now she would too. There were mishaps. There are always mishaps when a house is learning a new thing. The pail singed the edge of a woolen cloth and set it to smolder. Jon slapped his palm down on it, and the little burn took his skin and held it long enough to make him grunt and then let go. He wore the mark like a ring and did not hide it because to hide it would have felt like pretending he owned the creature rather than admitting the truth, which was the other way around. The green took a clumsy leap and fell among the bowls and broke one. The sound made Rickon cry, not from fear of the dragon but from the sharp crack, and Arya scooped both child and beast at once and soothed both in languages, one of words and one of motions. The dark, displeased by some movement in the corner, made a sound that brought men in from the corridor with hands on their knives, and then did nothing more than flick its tail with a dignity that made Ned, absurdly, want to bow to it as to a lord he had offended. The first snow-rain day of the week before the king would come, the watchman on the broken tower saw a smudge of banners far to the south and shouted though there was no need, for no one mistook a column that size for anything but what it was. Word came down the tower like a cascade, slapping from one stone to the next without losing its speed. Men lifted their heads. Women set bowls down and forgot to wipe their hands. The yard made that noise that is not noise, the intake of breath before a shout. Ned stood at the gatehouse and felt the oak under his palm as a living thing. "We will receive them outside the walls," he said. "We will not look like a house with the shutters barred." Catelyn began to move as if a dance had started, and she had known the steps since childhood. She sent to the kitchens with a word that wrung extra warmth from the ovens. She walked the path from the smaller hall to the larger and measured where benches should go in case the cold had more say than she wanted it to. She stood in Sansa's doorway and watched her daughter's hands, deft and neat, cage a riot of hair into a net of doilied wool. She scolded Arya once and did not scold her a second time when the girl came in with her braid half unraveled and her eyes like blackberries under the frost. She stood with Ned at the gate, last, and slipped her gloved hand into his for a moment, the touch brief as a thought. Before the horn sounded, before the gate was opened, before men took their places in ranks that would please a queen's eye and a king's pride, Jon was in the room above the pools with the pail against his chest. The dragon had grown in inches and in ways that could not be measured by anything he knew. Its wings rang like blades when it shook them. Its eyes had changed. Where they had been gem-pale, they now had a thin ring of darker color around the pupil that caught candlelight and held it. He stood with Ghost's head against his thigh and listened. The roar of the courtyard pressed upward through the stones as through lungs. He could hear the distant clatter of a pot dropped and someone's curse cut off. He could smell the particular tang of horses in the cold and men's nervous sweat and sweet resin from torches burned in daylight for show. The dragon turned its head and looked at the door. "Stay," Jon whispered, absurdly, and the creature did, if only because nothing in the room moved and there was nothing outside of Jon's voice to pull it. He knew with a clarity that made his mouth go dry that if he carried it down and stood in the yard with it on his shoulder, the world would tilt and would not right itself for a long time, if ever. He felt something like laughter and something like grief and something like anger bubble up in him, and he swallowed all three down and they burned in his throat like a draft out of a wrong cask. He set the dragon back in the chest and for the first time fastened the iron band across it so that the lid lay firm. Ghost wuffed. Jon set his palm to the iron as if checking the fastness of a door when a storm batters it, and then turned and went to the yard. The day had the sharp look of winter that has scrubbed every color clean. Robb stood in his place with his hair pulled back and the stark gray in his eyes like a story that had been told in this yard before. Theon leaned a little too far forward and made himself lean back with a flourish that fooled no one. Sansa held herself like a lady in a song and looked, for a moment, radiant as the first frieze when it makes ugliness beautiful. Arya scowled and then remembered not to and then scowled again and let it be. Bran stood where he could see and he saw, and later he would be able to tell a man exactly how many banners there had been and what colors rode what men. Rickon sat on Catelyn's hip and patted her shoulder as if to tell her that if she were frightened he would keep her from crying. They came in a long snake of men and horses and baggage, the royal standard sending black and gold rippling in winds that did not touch Winterfell's courtyard this day. The king rode at the front, belly and beard and a grin that cut through the cold like a remembered summer. He swung down from his horse as if it were a bit he had forgotten only yesterday, and came to Ned with a stride that made the space between them short in an instant. "Ned!" he bellowed, and the word was the boy's word and the man's and the king's all together. He pulled Ned into an embrace that made the north hold its breath, because a king's hand on a lord's back can feel like a knife or like a brother. This one felt like the latter. The queen came behind him under a hood that did not quite hide her hair, and behind her came Lannisters like gold coins spilled on a table, and behind them others, a river of faces that would fill the castle beyond its comfort. Ned bent the knee because that is what one does when a crown enters one's house, and rose and spoke words that were true and well-worn. "Winterfell is yours," he said, and the words struck against the iron band around what he had put away, and rang, and then were swallowed by the day's larger noise. Robert's laughter filled the yard. "It is good to see you, old friend," he said, and the way he said friend made men in earshot stand a little easier. "Come, show me your house. I am frozen hollow. I have ridden in rain that would put out a dragon." Ned swallowed his first answer, which would have been folly, and made himself smile with warmth he did feel in part. "There is warmth enough here for kings," he said. His sons and daughters came forward one by one in proper order. Names were spoken. Eyes met and measured. The queen's mouth curved when she looked at Sansa and flattened when it fell on Arya. Jaime Lannister's eyes skipped from steel to silk to stone and back to steel, as if measuring which would give him the best reflection of his own golden self. Tyrion Lannister's gaze went up to the shattered tower, and down to the stable-yard, and paused on the steam that drifted from the wing above the pools and narrowed briefly before he looked away and smiled at something a groom said that was not meant for him. No one spoke a word of what lay above the pools. That was a triumph. It might last a day. It might last a week. It would not last longer than the dragons allowed, and that was a truth that would sit in the room with them at every meal. That night was a feast. The north fed the south as if trying to prove that hunger had never lived in these halls. Men had second helpings of stew and third helpings of beer and peeled off their gloves and spread their hands toward the blaze as if fire were a thing new and interesting. The singers sang what they thought kings wanted and what the queen would not scowl at. Sansa's cheeks stayed pink and her eyes bright like a girl who had found her page in a story. Arya slid a little lower on her bench with each song until Catelyn touched her shoulder and the girl sat up and sighed and then pulled a face when no one watched and chewed a mouthful as if it were a piece of stale bread. Robb laughed a little too loudly at something Theon said, and then looked toward his father as if to check that his laugh had not crossed a line. Jon stood at the back with Ghost and ate his meat with the quiet hunger of someone holding another hunger clamped tight. At the high table, the king leaned to Ned and spoke as men speak in halls when they think the smoke and the noise and the wine make privacy. "When the feast is done," Robert said, "we will go to your crypts and visit your dead. I would see my sister." The words struck Ned harder than he had braced for. "As you wish," he said. He set his cup down and did not drink again, though the servants filled it twice. He felt the room tilt again and right itself, slower this time. The dragons slept above the pools or pretended to. He felt, absurdly, that the weirwood itself would be listening to this conversation with the same patience it gave wind. The queen saw the tilt in her husband's mouth and did not like it. She turned to Sansa and made a compliment about embroidery that shone like a knife. Sansa glowed, innocent of knives for another day. Tyrion Lannister caught Jon's eye from where he perched on a bench that put him level with no one and everyone, and flicked his gaze to Ghost with a half-smile, as if to say, "I see you," and Jon set a hand on the direwolf's head and looked away because he did not want to be seen by any man who made a habit of noticing. When the hall had been drained of light and noise and replaced with echoes and spilled bits of bread and a dog under a table licking at grease, Ned took a torch and the king took another, and they went down into the crypts with no one else, which is to say with their fathers and their fathers' fathers and all the wolves who had lain at their feet in stone. The cold there was an old cold. It had a shape and a smell. Robert's breath smoked in the light and he laughed once, short. "It's like a cellar of ale," he said. And then their feet rang against the stones and the words would not come so easily. They stood before Lioness Stone as two men who were boys still. Robert's face became a battlefield. Blow, recoil, grimace. The grin thrown up like a shield. Ned held the torch steady because sometimes duty is nothing more complicated than holding on to fire while someone else lets out a grief that will not sit quiet. "She should be here," Robert said thickly. "She should be my queen." Ned kept his face still. He did not say what truth crowded his throat like a gag. He simply said, "She is here." He looked at the stone face with its odd, carved sweetness and had that old thought again, that the sculptor had intended kindness and had given a girl a stranger's mouth. They climbed back up into a world where candles had burned low and men had crawled off pallets and women had leaned their heads back against chairbacks and slept with their mouths open because they had been too busy to remember how to go to their beds. Winterfell held them, as it holds all that come to it, and do not scowl too much at its drafts. In the room above the pools, 3 hearts beat, each at its own pace, and the heat they made rose along the logs and into the ceiling and made a bloom there that Luwin noticed in passing and did not in that moment worry over, because his head was full of kings and meals and a pair of loose nails in the gallery. Before dawn, Jon slid the bolt on the door to the dragon's room back carefully and eased inside. Ghost pushed past his legs and made a circuit, breath pumping, ears forward, almost silent. Jon opened the chest and the pail turned its head toward him and made a sound that was a question until his hand came down and then was only satisfaction. He lifted it and it climbed him quick as a squirrel. He went to the window and set his palm against the frost and felt how the cold ate into the heat in his hand and then ebbed back. He needed the outside. He needed the gods wood. Duty and caution pressed down on his shoulders like 2 men at once, joking and heavy. He stood there, spine against wood, and stilled himself until his breathing slowed into a rhythm that matched the dragons and ghosts. He did not open the shutter. He did not take a step toward the door. He did not move until the sky had gone from pearl to the blue that promises cold all day. By mid-morning, the queen had asked to see the godswood. She said it the way a person says she would like to see where the bread is baked while her maid gives a look that says she has no intention of eating it. Catelyn went with her because that is what one woman does for another woman even when neither would trust the other with a bucket of well water. Sansa went, stiff with the knowledge that the queen's eye sat on her shoulders like a cloak of gold chain. Septa Mordain went because propriety must be at one's elbow to be sure one holds it. Arya was told to come and came with her jaw set. The men of the south came to stand and be bored by trees. The men of the north stood and looked at faces they had loved longer than they had loved any person alive and felt nothing of boredom except what other men might throw over them when rare feelings make them awkward. The weirwood was white and red and holy itself. The queen tilted her head before its serene and terrible face, as if it had insulted her by not turning. "You keep strange gods in the cold," she said. Catelyn pictured briefly, and with stark pleasure, the lines her mother would have used to answer that in Riverrun's sunny hall. She smoothed them away. "We keep the old ways," she said mildly. "The hot pools make the winter shorter, and the old gods make long nights shorter still. Each house holds what holds it together." The queen's mouth tipped. "Some houses," she said, and walked past Catelyn so close that the line of a seam brushed the Tully wool. Sansa whispered something that might have been an apology for the North and might only have been a sound to fill the air. Arya caught the weirwood's eye and lifted her chin at it, daring it to say something. Said nothing, as always. The air had a taste of iron and of something else that made men think of lightning when there were no storms. Back in the yard, a Lannister knight laughed as Theon tossed a practice blade at Robb and nearly caught a stable boy who had chosen the wrong time to run across the yard with a pail. The laugh was loud enough to turn heads. Theon made a bow for the laugh and then flicked his eyes to Jaime Lannister and saw a man who had been told from the cradle that he was the sort of man other men measured themselves against. He smiled back with a flash of teeth that had not a scrap of deference in it and was pretty enough to be mistaken for it. Benjen went to the wall again that afternoon because a man who has taken a vow can only bend so long before he hears it crack. He kissed Arya's head and made a joke that made her snort and then made it serious in a whisper only she heard, which was, "Tell your father if you see something you cannot name in the woods," and she nodded as if he had told her where he had hid a pastry. He put his hand on Jon's shoulder and said, "Keep to your sense," and Jon nodded hard enough to make the dragon shift. Benjen's eyes swept the steam drifting up from the roof and went flat for a heartbeat. And then he turned and went, and Winterfell felt a little emptier for it. At dusk, Ned walked the wall alone. He had a habit of touching each Merlin as if counting. Today he counted and did not count. Men had been set at the stair to the room above the pools with orders clear enough to stick. The queen had smiled as if there were nothing in the world to hide. Robert had clapped his shoulder and told him he would ask him a favor and had not yet asked. The cold came up like a thing on four legs, not yet leaping, pacing, muscles warmed for the run. He thought of the weight of the dark dragon on his arm. He thought of how it had turned its head toward Catelyn and then away again. He thought of his sister's stone face and of Robert's real one, red and alive and exhausted by its own appetites. Snow began again, light as ash. He turned toward the Godswood and stood at its edge a while without going in. He could hear water. He could smell the mineral tang that always reminded him of the forge. He could feel the weirwood's old attention like the pressure of a palm between his shoulders. "You sent us fire," he said into air that might carry or might swallow the sound. "We will not give it to men who would put it out for the pleasure of watching it die." He stood a little longer. Then he went to his house and his bed and did not sleep the way a man does not sleep when he knows someone he loves will put his head on his shoulder in an hour and say the thing he has brought all this way, and the shape of the words will change what the shoulder belongs to. In the room above the pools, the pale drowsed with one eye open. The green twitched in its sleep as if flying in dreaming air. The dark lay with its head lifted just enough to keep its throat off the wool. It had Lear. Ned Heat and knew how to keep its own store of it like a miser. Ghost lifted his head, smiled his toothy no-smile, and put it down again. Jon sat with his back to the wall and his knees drawn up and his hands laid across them and did not close his eyes. Somewhere below, in the long hall, a strain of a song drifted up when a drunk man forgot to lower his voice. Wind went its endless road along the roof timber and cried its soft cry. The steam curled. The heat there had a shape. He watched it until there was no difference between watching and breathing. He watched it until the night said his name and he rose without letting it fall from his mouth. He watched it until the morning came on like a slow spill of milk and the day changed, as days do and as some do not.